focus on data and data management. And when we set up this panel, it was sort of, well, hopefully data will come up a little bit on the first day because then it would be worth having a panel on data. And I was actually surprised just how often data came up yesterday. And I picked out a few specific comments from some of the different presentations we heard yesterday. The first one was just perfect. It said, as a researcher, we need to be able to run the code. I mean, that just sounds fairly obvious, but obviously very rarely happens these days. The other one I thought was also very interesting is we need models for defining the boundaries of the scholarly record. Again, not something we've probably had a really broad discussion about in our industry. Next one, these were all from the Ithaca report, by the way. The next one was societies can be the place where research data can be collated and synthesized to form new research. Again, an interesting thought, but I don't know if we've talked about that. David Berkowitz mentioned that a key problem is where are the data sets and how can they be shared? And the future will be all about data. And then the last one, Darren, the editor of BIOS, he suggested straight up that publishers could help with data management policies, including software. So some big asks really for us to look at. And I've got a fantastic panel here of really passionate people about data. So we're not going to do slides. I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their reflections on what they heard yesterday and what's important to them. And then we're going to get straight into the discussion. So first of all, on my left is Shelley Stahl, who's the VP for Open Science at the American Geophysical Union. And then next to her is Jennifer Gibson, who's the Executive Director of Dryad. And then on the end, we have Julian Schneider, who is a research librarian at Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. Sorry, I can't read my handwriting. So thank you so much for joining us. We had a very lively discussion yesterday evening about this topic, so I don't think we'll have any trouble filling an hour. But Shelley, can I ask you to kick us off?
Jane, I would love to do that.
Thank you.
It is such an honor to be up here with this team because we've all worked together in different ways. So I've been at the AGU for almost 9 years now, if you can believe that, for those of you who've worked with me. And when I first joined, one of the projects that was happening at the time, led by Brooks Hansen and Kirsten Leonard, was a group called COPDES. And if you've been part of it, thank you. If you haven't, you should be jealous. So the Coalition on Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. And what the goal was, and this really embodies a lot of my work going forward, was the goals around this particular group, was bringing together all of the Earth and Space and environmental science journals that you all represent and agreeing that Earth and space science data is a world heritage, by the way, codified in our data position statement at AGU, and that we will make sure it's cared for, that it will matter in our society, that the data that supports the research of our researchers and any of the many interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work that we do, that it will be cared for, it will be preserved, it will be well documented, and we'll all get credit for it. That's literally been my work ever since. And there, as you know, tons of challenges. And if we're thinking about data as part of the scientific record, which was some of the conversations in these last hours and yesterday, there's a lot that you all can help teach the data repository community on what that means to have the scientific record, and vice versa, the scientific community, I'm looking over at Julianne and the libraries and such, that the data is an evolving item. And what does it mean to version control that and know it's not preserved in a one and done? And software as well, software even more so. It's not preserved in that moment, it actually evolves and goes forward. So what does that mean in our digital space where maybe those kinds of things could be taught back to us as journalists and our journal representatives, that our papers are not one and done and that they could be versioned. So there's my provocative thing.
Great.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for inviting me and Dryad to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to start the way Shelley did and say that my views today are very much informed by my most immediate experience. So before Dryad, I was at eLife. And at eLife, I had the chance to talk about transformations in peer review and how to make the article more replicable, what data and software need to be made more readily and openly available to fully leverage the digital networked environment in favor of science. So that was fun. Point of pride, I was the third person hired to eLife after the editor-in-chief and executive director. But 10 years, and I just wanted to do something different. And this conversation around the need to have access to more objects in the computational environment was very, very compelling. And Dryad is about data and about getting beneath the skin of the article. So that's the enthusiasm that I bring. I want to start with my reflections on what I heard and what I think that means. That's what I should do next, right? Okay. So really, this is my first STM meeting, and it's just been a ball. I've really, really enjoyed the conversations. And what I think I've heard so far is that the importance of high volume, quality, reliable, well-described research data specifically in an environment where machines are more fully deployed to work for us is clear. The potential for humans and machines to collaborate. Stuart at Silverchair, excellent diagram. I really, really like how humans at Dryad, they're as curators. So human curators interacting with the data. We really want to use AI in our processes to make them more scalable, but there has to be a conversation between the human and the machine to design that process and to design something that's trustworthy. So that's really, really interesting. That's a good takeaway. But then the flip side, I think, made clear from Cynthia and Leo yesterday was the danger if we don't. What if we, let AI carry on without input and guidance from us here, or and leave it in the hands of corporations with much more money and just a kind of a single voice. I think the boundaries there were really useful to talk about. My favorite thing, I think, so far is that I'm hearing a more clear and collective sense that knowledge will proliferate and continue to flow outside and around the established boundaries of traditional publishing. It's already happening, and how can we stop it? It's going to continue. And that, to me, evokes the potential and the importance of reimagining traditional publishing functions in this environment. So publishers are expert conveners of the experts, identifying the disciplinary leads to bring them together in editorial boards and as peer reviewers to then marshal them and deploy them and chase them and make sure they do the peer review. So we can't take for granted that will happen of its own accord. That work there is essential, and a role that I can see as very, very important in this new computationally enabled environment. So how that changes my views on data in the last day, or what it's reinforced in my mind, is that we've got to work together. So Dryad was designed in a way that we get the researcher's attention at the point of publication. Something I'm really grateful for because it makes my job a little bit easier. That's where the researcher's attention is focused. So that was really smart. But as institutions, universities get more involved, and funders get more involved, the NIH wants the data after the data management and sharing plan, which is way ahead of the story being written, way ahead of the preprint, way ahead of the article being published. So how do we work together to build systems and processes for the future? The stakeholders are changing as well. We've got to be talking to one another to say, in the institutions in particular, it's not just the libraries that are our contacts, it's also the chief technology officers, the research grants offices, provosts. The stakeholders are different. So we need to continue to talk to make sure we're having the right conversations. And I think Jane was at last night, we were saying, how might publishers interpret the axes of risk that Cynthia and Leo were talking about? And I wonder how that picture might be enriched if we all talk together. So not these guys and those guys, but let's talk together, because we're collaborators and have shared interests in ways that we haven't before, at least in my experience. It feels like I've got just two more points. That in this environment, we need to keep doing what we're doing with respect to data curation. So there are a lot of repositories out there that have been doing different degrees of curation for decades. And if we want well-described, reliable data to be available as inputs to the machines, this work needs to carry on and expand. And my final point is that the data infrastructure needs some love and some attention. So I'm still new to data. It's just been 2.5 years for me. But it happens that if a project is funded, they generate a bunch of data, and then it's not funded, the data have no money to be preserved anymore. There are repositories that are solely grant funded from the NSF, the NIH, and Heather from Chicago's project was represented at a recent meeting of NIH repositories that are all still sat at campuses. There was like 150 of them, and the NIH call was to say, how are you going to make these things sustainable? We mustn't take for granted that this data is going to persist, or that new data is going to persist. So I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. So thank you. Just a
Thank
few
you.
starting thoughts.
Great. So, Gillian, I think you've come in very nicely on the institution side and the library and the government, in fact. So,
Yes,
yeah.
all those things. Hi, I'm Julian Schneider. I am a metadata librarian for the Pacific Northwest National Labs. I actually have a degree in library science and one in information systems, so I've always been at the juncture of discovery and technology. I am the world's worst research librarian. Thank God I didn't go that direction because I can't find things in our team's space. So, forget looking for articles. But I'm really fascinated by how people discover things. And I started out, I graduated in '97. I started in a startup because I refused to take academic cataloging salaries. So that was my first reaction. But I was doing indexing for a startup, and then I was an insurance librarian down on Wall Street, and then I was the metadata librarian for NYU Medical School. And then we moved to Boston, and I couldn't get a job, so I ended up at EBSCO doing database design. So I was in the back end of the house. And then I was at Copyright Clearance Center for a hot second, and then I went to Harvard Medical School as their medical metadata librarian. And then I got bored there, so I went to UC San Diego and did a research data management temp job. And then where did I go next? Oh, I went to Harvard. I went back to Harvard for a couple of years to do repository management in their clinical and translational science center. Worked at Sage Bionetworks for a while, and now I'm at PNL. So I've been through industry, academia, and now government. And government is every bit as weird as academia, just different kind of weird. And I think what struck me is, well, first of all, congratulations on the trust panel. I think you were the only one that didn't mention AI. Congratulations. But I've been kind of marking down like how many times people said AI, and I've kind of like, I kind of gave up just doing hash marks because I didn't want to get carpal tunnel. But it's what I found striking is we did talk about data, but what AI needs is well-structured, well-managed data. And that's very hard and very expensive to do. And I think what's going to be interesting is, what's interesting to me is how this is, I've seen this cycle before. I was creating natural language processing tools back in 2010 at Harvard Medical when we were automatically pulling mesh headings out of digital documents using the UMLS as a concept pool. And it was interesting because what I found was we managed to get it. We had 100, done by, like cataloged by a human expert, and then we tested it against our algorithm, and we got it up to about 90% accuracy. And these were historical textbooks, like from 1865 to like, I don't know, right after the First World War, because there was a lot of pamphlets on cleanliness. It was Boston. So it worked really well, except for anything dealing with women's health, because the language has so drastically changed from hysteria and megrims to modern day women's health. So with AI, language is going to continually change, and the LLMs are going to have to keep up with it. Some sciences move rather slowly. Medicine moves pretty quickly. And I remember I was continually updating our mesh headings and our catalogs. And I think Mesh, instead of Teratoma, until 2010, Teratoma was still monster as a term. So sometimes it lags a little. But I'm seeing this, I'm seeing, new technology come in. And I mean, who doesn't remember the linked data panic? Um, I remember having to tell librarians at Harvard, like, we are not going to be typing out triples. That's not how this works. And they were convinced that they were going to be doing the same thing they were with MARC records. I'm like, no, it's a different technology and we're going to handle it differently. And then we realized linked data is too expensive to do because it's storage is still a huge problem. There was a point where I think we thought we solved it. And now with AI, it is so expensive and these data sets are so huge. Storage has reared its head again. And that's like the biggest issue we're having with our scientists is where do I put my data? Oh, and we also need a large language model and a big test corpus. Well, good luck. We have several, storage options. Which one do you want to pay for? And it's, again, follow the money. How is this going to develop? We're going to have to follow the money and see what institutions are willing to do and pay for with this. I'm trying to work on an LLM now, and it's an in-house created one for nuclear science because nobody in nuclear science can talk to each other because it's all locked down and classified. So we all have to literally be in our silos. And it's usable, but it's super researchy, which means it's in our GitLab, but there's not a lot of documentation. We're not really sure where the test data is. They're willingly working with us. They've been great collaborators, but it's research. It's not something that we can just plug and play. So there's, if you're getting worried about AI and that you don't know enough, don't worry. The rest of us are struggling too. It's AI is interesting, but we've been through this cycle before. And I think that it's going to play out similarly. So.
Okay, so the first question I was going to ask is just taking it one step beyond data and the issue of software. That was the first thing that came up yesterday is I want to be able to run the code. And then how do we connect the software to the data? I think that's a challenge that we probably haven't even started to grapple with. So I don't know if any of you want to tackle that one.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I do that every day because I mean, almost all research outcomes include at least data and software. And our software is located all over the place. We don't know where it is. It's often in people's personal GitHubs, which is not supposed to happen, but it does. And we're trying to get our tech transfer people involved because, I've been doing a lot of classes on, I don't care how open you think it is, unless you put a license on it, no one else is going to know it's open. So you have to put a license on it, even if you can, anybody can do anything with it. And I'm connecting it through currently projects, by funded project. RAID is an interesting, rather unfortunately named, but interesting thought coming out of the ADRC, where it's project-based metadata, and then it'll have a DOI, and then you hook the DOIs of all your objects into that structure. So I think that's promising. But I think it's, again, storage and telling our researchers where they should be putting stuff. And then once we find it, then we can start linking it up through things like DOIs and effective metadata.
I'd like to add on to what Julian said, and what that makes absolutely perfect sense to me. And I would add just a couple more aspects. So, so software, code, models. Our author guidelines for AGU journals include recommendation for if your research, it does include software that you would want to consider sharing that. And that's led us down a path that's been really fascinating. So our James journal, which is all about modeling, and we just started our new AI machine learning journal. They're very keen to get software in, and the editors-in-chief have decided that they are taking what is a recommendation into a mandate. So through those authors over the last few years, we've hit all of the things that Julian's just talked about. And something to bring to your attention is when a researcher's thinking about their software, first of all, they are not okay sharing it. It's sloppy and ugly and gross. And one of the things that we as a community need to help them with is that social a vulnerability that we're asking them to do. We want you to share your software because it's transparency for your research, but we realize you're uncomfortable. And what does that mean for peer review? And we haven't really done that yet. It's something that actually we're working on this year. And that software is a moment in time for them. So when they think about preserving it for this scientific record, and connecting it, like GitHub has a nice connection to Zenodo. I think it has a connection to Figshare as well. That's brilliant and works really well, but they don't think like that. So we're like, listen, it's okay. You can also include the GitHub link to your repo, but please know that's not a preservation repository. And none of you in this room should be telling a researcher that GitHub is good enough for preservation. It's not. Talk to me later. Or Julianne, I'm sure she knows too. So it's a different kind of animal because that software will evolve. And you need two things. The researcher needs you to provide through the journal two things. One, the version of record at the time of the research, but then also if you're going to build on that software for your own research, the current version of that software. So both the GitHub and the preserved version. And that was a lot of consultation with AAS. AGU worked with AAS on this and the ADS indexing system. So it was a collaborative effort with this community, not just our folks. So thank you for all of that collaboration.
I've got a
Yeah.
slightly, just a little bit more richness, a different experience to offer. So Dryad is a broad spectrum repository. We only publish data openly, and so we publish everything that doesn't belong in a specialist repository. So we serve a lot of domains, and I think it's worth looking at this through the lens of where different disciplines are. Right,
Mm-hmm.
some are at the frontier, and some are going to catch up in the next life. So in our community, it's the evolutionary biology and the ecology folks who design Dryad. So in my experience, they're pioneers, and so with their support, what we're looking for, and again, it's through the lens of journal publishing and publishers, what we're looking for is data and related objects as they existed at the time that the article was put on paper, right? So we want to be able to demonstrate the story. So to Shelley's point, we want the software as it existed in that iteration. So we do ask researchers to publish the software along with their data if there is any, and through our curation process, we're checking those files that we can run the software as well, and then redirect it into Zenodo because it's a more appropriate place and because they support licensing for software in a way that we don't. What we're learning through this experience is that researchers don't want their software to be separated. So they, in our experience, for those who are willing to share their software, they want the two to be nested together. So they're often written to talk to one another, right? And they're just really, really averse to then diverting the software into Zenodo and keeping the data separate. So it's a conversation ongoing, and we're just flexible with them at the moment. I mean, the fact that they're sharing their data and code together, that's a win. So we can work on the licensing a little bit later on.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question partly for the panel, but also partly for the audience. I think this is one that we really all have to grapple with is who's responsible for what? Who is responsible for setting the guidelines? Who's responsible for deciding what is data? Who's responsible for the hosting, storage, curation, and ongoing management? So big question. So Shelley, do you want to kick off?
I have
'Cause
opinions.
You have a strong view on this?
I have opinions, people. Okay, so let's start with you all, journals, in case you weren't sure. So what you really need is to make sure that you're giving an opportunity for your researchers to link in the data, link in the software. Now, we've talked about, do we want to separate it? Do we not? Frankly, getting it to share it all, that's a win. So some flexibility there. But we should hold ourselves accountable for making sure we gather everything that went into that research effort and that we provide all of those links into the downstream services. What does that mean? Get the data cited properly. As we all know, it ends up in the references, and you have to get those links right so that Crossref can understand them, so they get to event data, so they eventually hit data cited onto Scalix. If you don't know that workflow, that's a problem, and you need to know that workflow. So we're responsible for that. We're the authoritative source for that linkage. We are not the authoritative source for the data set preserved in a repository and the software preserved in a repository. We just link it. So we need to actually lean into the rest of the community for them to support the scientific record, but they're not all there yet. So I'm sure there's more. I'm going to pass it because
Okay, pass it along. I'm sure that Jennifer has views on this one.
Yeah, I'm just a fan of collaboration. Maybe I can't believe I'm still this idealist at this stage in my career, but everyone has strengths to bring to bear, you know, and the publishers, the journals have the researchers' attention, got the attention. So how do we use that power to influence the types of changes and behaviors that we collectively want to see? There's also the art of metadata and describing material in a way that helps it to travel across the digitally networked environment. But at the same time, the institutions are accountable, feel accountable to the government and the policies that are coming out and being shouldered by the research management offices. So what type of collaboration is there? If we take data in that experience, the funder's funding the data is being generated, the funder wants the data to be described effectively to say, I funded this. The institution is helping to shoulder responsibility, by calling someone else in on many occasions to get the data preserved and shared. And then, you know, there's this kind of spectrum of activity between data generation and the publication where I kind of see institutions moving forward in the process and publishers moving backward. Some of our publishers and journals are asking for more data at the point of submission rather than at peer review and publication. So as we come closer together, what responsibilities, competencies do we share?
I was thinking about this a little more pragmatically, especially from my time at Sage when I was responsible for gathering and putting into a repository research outcomes for over 100 grants, most of them from NIA, some of them from NIMH. And one of the things I found was the research workflow and the publication workflow are like somewhat askew. They don't match up all that well. Because the researcher would come to me and they need a DOI because the publisher, you know, needs to know that they've got somewhere to put their data when they're done with it. So I'd give them the DOI and I'd give them our data availability statement with their DOI and be like, put this in the paper. Sometimes that happened. And when it did, it worked out unless they just decided that they didn't need to give me the data. So they published the paper and it would go out with the data availability statement and there would be no data behind that DOI. And so whose responsibility? Is it the funder who's going to track that stuff down? Was it Sage? Is it, I mean, like who is going to have the resources to actually go in and make sure that all this stuff is getting done? Because it's a lot of time and it's a lot of money to do that. So, you know, whose responsibility and whose shoulders are those kind of things going to fall on in this big process that we've instituted to make sure that we do good science and get it out there and make it accessible?
Okay, that's a question for all of you. Anybody want to chime in with some ideas? Nobody got any ideas on what to do about data?
I'm not alone.
Okay. We got some opinions.
Oh,
Got some ideas here.
friends, you need to weigh in. So I'm really lucky. The members of AGU really believe in the data being connected to the journal research. So we've had years of recommendations for data citation, then mandates. And in 2023, nearly 95% of our papers had a data citation. I'm not telling you that it was all there. I'm not telling you that it was all perfect, but we had a data citation for 95%. And the way we did it is not because it was easy. there's a great story. A bottle of wine should be involved in that story. But in short, it was some of you have many journals. We have 24. So we could work with each editor team and did so over 3 years. So we did it one by one and walked the editors, the staff, the reviewers, the authors through an understanding of, for that journal, what did it mean to cite the data? What did it mean to cite sometimes the software? And it was a true education. That's how we got there. And it was very difficult. There was baggage. There was, I'm not sharing my data. There was.
So, what about the question of whether or not societies should be taking a lead in this? Is that something that any of the societies in the room want to comment on? Not looking at anyone in particular? Trying not to look at anyone in particular?
Where's AAAS? Come on, get your hand up. Sorry, this is not an under the bus moment, honest. This is a lifting up moment.
No, I think it's absolutely right that societies should be taking the lead. We have an opportunity to educate our authors and editors too, but authors in particular, about best practices for data sharing, the importance of linking data and code and software to the paper, citations, preservation, all of that. And I'll just mention our AAAS's partnership with Dryad. Hi, Jen. We've been working together for about a year and a half, I think now, and it's going great. So we've had a very positive experience, and I'd encourage other societies to do the same.
Hi, I'm Darla Henderson with FASTSUB. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what we've been doing on the data front, but also partners with Dryad, so shout out to integrating Dryad into our submission system and making that process seamless for our authors to upload data. But we also have a larger program called DataWorks, which has 3 components. And the first is a prize that we sponsor with NIH every year. And it's a $500,000 prize pool that recognizes some of the important work that's happening on the data management and sharing. And you all heard yesterday from Heather from Chicago on that front. So that's one of our efforts. And then the other 2 efforts on that front are a series of conversation spaces and salons that happen monthly around different topics, sort of a safe space to come and learn about data management and sharing. And the third is an introductory help desk that we've set up to try to provide resources to our community and drive culture change. Thank you.
I think that point in particular is something that I've heard over a couple of sets of workshops that I've been to over the last couple of years, is there's so many questions that our researchers have about, well, what do you mean by data? Do you want all my data or just the data I use to write the paper? How deep do you want me to go? So setting standards and doing training and providing guidelines, I think, is something that all journals could do. But I think deciding what the data is something that each community somehow has to come together and make some decisions around as a starting point, in the same way that AGU has done. Has anybody else got any experience of setting that? Here we go. You've got one here. Thanks, Liz.
So yeah, I'm going way back in time to the joint data archiving policy that was announced by the editors-in-chief of a whole series of ecology and evolution journals across society, and Jen's already made reference to some of this, but across society journals, across journals that were owned by publishers. And what the thing that drove those editors was, we're in a subject domain that moves relatively slowly for life sciences trajectory. We believe that we will be more successful in obtaining grants if we get the data out of the hands of our community and into the public domain, so we can all build on it faster and just get this, better turnaround going in our discipline. And that was the sort of motivating factor that gave a higher goal for everyone to participate. And it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't easy at all. It took time for the community to come to terms with that. But because the leading journals had that position of power that they were wielding for good, it actually drove that change. The societies came on board very, very quickly and were delivering the trainings, delivering brochures to their members about what does it mean. And actually, you don't get held out and strung up if your data isn't beautifully presented just like make that first step and get with doing it. And Dryad was supremely helpful. It wouldn't have happened without Dryad. And so initiatives like that are tremendously important for publishers to support as well as societies and so on.
Just sort of building on what Liz just said, it comes back to incentives again. The thing that I have often heard from researchers is, this is my whole work, this is my intellectual property, this is what my whole endeavor is about. Why should I share that with everybody else? Because if I share it with everyone else, then they can build on the work I have done, and they don't necessarily get rewarded for that. And so again, I think I think responsibility and the people who decide on what's important need to think about the incentives for data sharing, because I think the researcher has a point in that case.
Yeah, hi. I'm interested in the panel's views on the data sharing requirements in the Nelson Memo, particularly the level of investment that's going to be needed across the community to make that happen, and where that investment's going to come from.
I think I'm going to wander into a project that I think Shelley conceived. So bear with me. Hi, Chris. Interesting question. The NIH is out ahead of the other agencies with their policy being implemented in January last year.
25.
20.
No, 20.
It's 24 now. Anyway, the first. They're
Good
the
job.
first. It's in place. And what they did as the result of a conversation that Shelley led with Marianne Martone at UCSD was get all the generalist repositories together and give us money to sort some stuff out.
We didn't know about the money, by the way, when we had the
You would have charged a commission.
Yeah, we didn't know that.
So there are a lot of questions here, and one of them is how might the government save money if the 7 generalist repositories begin to adopt common approaches to things? So, if Dryad was to go out on her own and decide which institution ontology to use, and Figshare was to do a different one, then that's just creating cost in the system. So the generalist repository ecosystem initiative is really important if you're not familiar with it already. It's about adopting common approaches. And I raise it because I'm curious about how the other American agencies might be moved to direct their money in that way as well. I know it's not a who's going to pay for this type of answer, but I think it's a really interesting approach and a powerful contribution.
Julianne, do you want to talk from a government perspective?
Sure. So the PNNL is a Department of Energy lab, and there's 17 of them. And I will say that they didn't ever seem, and I've only been there a year and a half, but I have not seen much about their vision around data or their strategy. I was at NLIT, which is the the DOE's like IT summit at the first week of this month. And the chief data officer came and actually did a presentation on data strategy. And I was like, woohoo, although it conflicted with mine, so nobody came to my presentation. But the line was like out the door, because it's like, oh my God, the CDOs showed up and they gave him a tiny room. So, but I got the slides. I'm looking at the slides, and nary a Nelson memo did I find. I'm not sure they know it exists. And it's going to be really interesting because, PNNL it crosses so many disciplines. We've got NIH grants wandering around there somewhere, in addition to all the earth sciences and the renewable energy and the nuclear science. And how we're going to get the Nelson memo stuff in place by next year, I'm kind of baffled by. We've got an informal data curation working group across all the labs that we're trying to compare what platform are you using for your repositories? What schemas are you using? So that we can start doing some collaboration. But I feel very, very behind that particular poisoned 8-ball. I'm not sure, so how serious are they with this memo? Because I don't know if we're going to meet the deadline, honestly.
Shelley, do you want to comment?
I'd like to double down on what Julianne just said. So the workshop that kicked off the Generalist Repository effort coming from NIH was absolutely brilliant. And but there's a missing piece, and that's what Julian's talking about, is they're not all data. So this is Shelley's opinion, but I think you can all be evangelists with me, so please join in. Certain data should go into certain repositories. Not all data is as important as other data. There's not really guidelines on what all of that is. And when a researcher, so we have a help desk. So FASIP has a help desk. AGU has a help desk in partnership with the Earth Science Information Partners. They're funded by NASA, NOAA, and USGS. All of the experts are there for the Earth and space scientists. Brilliant, like 300. It's awesome. There's a Slack channel. You should join. And any question can come, and we can find an expert, and that's great. To this day, despite having run this help desk for nearly 7 years, to this day, number one question, what data do you want me to share again? Second question, where do you want me to put it? And they're literally incredibly difficult to answer because at the help desk level, we're not sitting inside the discipline research and what that value is. Case in point, did you know for hydrology that the software is really important and the data is somewhat less important because it's very regional? Did it ever occur to you that way? No, we're pushing for our hydrology journal. You must save that data. You know, I'm not sure about that software. It really matters that we work with the disciplines in order to do that. Okay, so coming back to Julianne's point and Chris's question, the discipline-specific repositories are not as well organized as the generalist repositories. It is nigh on impossible to get them all together and agreeing upon one common path. They want to, but it's very hard. It would be brilliant if we could say, dear researcher, and please, when I say that, filter out those researchers supported by satellites, those researchers who have really great data programs built in to their infrastructure. I'm talking about more of the long tail, more of the, you don't have the infrastructure that NASA provides, you don't have the infrastructure that NOAA provides, more NSF-y, more NIH-y, although I think NIH actually is doing a better job. Sorry, NSF. Oh, is that guy still here? Oh, geez. Sorry.
Can't see you.
Okay. Hi, we can talk. But it's inequitable. The support that a researcher gets when they don't have those big systems is inequitable. And we're going to say to them that data needs to be stored, and I don't want you to throw it away. It's not about being transparent. It's about being reusable. And that's just not going to happen unless we invest. You're right, Chris.
So let's take us in a different direction. Anybody in the social sciences in the room want to talk about how it, what it means to be a social scientist and want to deposit or want to require data deposit? Again, trying not to look at certain key individuals. Robert, do you want to comment? No. Okay, so I do have a couple of last questions. We've got a little bit more time. If there are no more questions in the room immediately. Oh, we have one. Sorry. Okay. We have another question from the room first.
Yeah,
we
hi.
have two.
Don Kumka from Infolinks, Alan's partner. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring the trust factor up. Data management, everything I've heard so far is about basically archiving data, and it's a noble task in terms of keeping all of that. But is anybody, as part of that archiving, checking the data? Like, what is actually being archived? Is there anything that is part of that process that validates that the data is actually the data that was used, that was in fact relevant, or is it creating a frictionless process as a fraudster? I love that. You're going to make it easy for me to dump something in there, and I'm on my way.
Can I read into
Very good question. Of course, please do.
We make all of your problems go away. So I can't speak to the specialist repositories, of course, but they do in-depth curation, not only describing the data set in depth with metadata, but then drawing clear connections to available literature. So that's very, very thorough. To my knowledge, Dryad is the only generalist repository that curates every data set.
Truth.
Truth. So, so by curation, so spectrum of activity, say, so at the far end of the curation spectrum is consulting the literature for stuff that I can't describe because I'm not a specialist repository. On our end, we have a human open every data set to make sure it can be opened, that it is there, you know, not to be taken for granted, that there's a README file, that it's in English and not Swiss German for the until we sort out the translation stuff. So, so we're the only ones who do that, and we make sure that software can be opened. What we're not doing is checking the veracity of the data. We're not checking that that it backs up the conclusions in the paper. We don't always have access to the paper, so we're not going any farther than that yet. But the world has changed, and we're talking about how we need to change with it.
But I can add a little bit. So when we put our mandate in that every data set must be cited, we also updated our peer review guidelines. And it was, we were very specific on, we will make sure the data is available to you to peer review. We would like you to check the following things. And what was coming back was, in these early days, I haven't heard this recently, was somebody put a URL that had the word data in it to something that had nothing to do with research data. We did catch that. And then there was websites where it's the project website, but there's no data there. So some of those, well, we're not really sure. Let's just say these were honest mistakes. I don't know if they were or not, but let's just say they were. And over time, our authors have learned that we're really quite serious. We do have some peer review, some editors that will go in and actually make sure all of the data is there, and they do ask questions on the other side. We are also learning about some of the techniques of not wanting to share the data because there's fear of scooping, and so not all of the data will be put in, and many times that's not caught. That is a real issue. We do require, to Julianne's point, we do require that the URL be active and working with the data there before we actually fully accept the paper. So we do check that. So I don't know that everybody else does that, but we have added in additional FTEs in order to do these extra checks. So it's a financial burden to do that. But I would also agree on when we were talking about it's not time, but the time you're going to go publish. Julian talked about the workflow of the researcher life cycle, the grant life cycle not being in sync with the publishing life cycle. Oh, double downing on that, absolutely. And by the time you figure out that you're going to publish, that data should have already been in a repository. And we just have to get our researchers used to thinking like that. It does take Dryad some time to get that curation to happen. It's not seconds. Nearly 95, roll back. Of those data citations I was telling you about, about 95% of our papers have it. Nearly 75% are in Zenodo, which means you got that DOI in a second. And there's no curation unless the author did it. So you got transparency, some level of transparency, but you got no reproducibility or interoperability, zip. So in my mind, I will be provocative. It's kind of trash. It's trash. You don't want any AI going after that. None. Do not do that.
Yeah, at PNNL, those that can afford us, I'm lead a curation team, and we go in and we set up the processes and get the data from the instrument. So we're there, like, embedded into that whole process. But that's a very small portion of the data that comes out of the lab. What I'm also finding increasingly is groups get funding to do a project, and they spin up an Invenio repository and just put it all in there. And it's actually, they're beautiful repositories. Several of them have, like, you can cite data by data stream. Like, it's that granular, and that's amazing. But it doesn't help us when we're trying to get the big picture of what PNNL is doing, because so much of this not only feeds into personal portfolios, but it feeds into the metrics that our leadership team uses to make big strategic decisions. So I keep telling them, you need to get me you need to give me permission to set up good metadata so I can give you good data so that you can make good decisions for the future.
Brilliant.
And so that's the argument I make to them, and it's starting to work slowly.
Adrian, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Adrian Stanley, consultant, and in full disclosure, I do support a company called DataSeer. Just talking today about, and in the working groups, about the atomized article and data and trust, it seems clear that there's no real incentive for a publisher to publish papers with or without data. I mean, Shelley, you do a great job, and your team, but shouldn't there be some ways that there's either an additional APC or fee if a publisher does a job well to support the data, so it isn't just the article, it's a research paper? Like, should we be thinking about that? Would publishers be more interested in doing more with data if they got another $200 or $300 an article type thing? But I would also just give a shout out to PLOS and their open science indicators, because they are, I think, publicly showing how many of their journals are sharing data, code, protocols. And I think that's a great initiative too. So, but yeah, thanks.
Shirley, would you like to be paid?
I think I might have to apologize. So just a moment as I say what I will have to apologize for. Unless you have Julian on your team, please do not be in the business of being the preservation for data. Please don't. You are not the expert. Now, if you want to do a generalist repository, invest in Dryad. People, come on, they're doing a brilliant job. Do not start your own. There is no reason to start a new
Sorry,
repository.
can
No,
I just, what I was meaning, because can publishers verify the links and data, not make the data in a repository, just be there to
Just
say, this has been
manage-
done?
No, not
So,
managing that. No,
Whew.
not that.
Okay, no need to apologize then. Yes, they should. They should verify. Absolutely. And I think you can actually do that with a little tool. I mean, yeah, you should absolutely. But peer review needs to, this is the research, this is the data I'm looking for. Now, there's more, right? Like for instance, if you have lightning data, that's binary data, that's really, really big. Saving it and preserving it and citing it is nearly impossible because it's so hard to read, and why did you bother? So we really have to think about what we're asking a researcher to do in their discipline. So I think in general, yes, but right now I'm doing the layers of onions on, okay, the editors have been looking at me wonky, sure we'll do it, but do you realize it's stupid? And now I'm getting to the conversation of, okay, for you, why is it stupid? But that's the individual situations. The big picture is, we are the hammer. There aren't many hammers out there. There's funders and there's publishers. And if we need a change to happen, it's us and funders. Who's going to make the change first? Us.
Okay, I'm going to challenge that. What about the institutions, Julia?
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Double down.
Should the institutions also be trying to be the hammer and getting their research?
I try. I do a lot of education work that I wasn't expecting to do. But I think the researchers are just like afraid and confused because the world's changing kind of quickly and there's a lot of demands and funders, want different things. So I think they want to do the right thing, but they're just like super busy and they get conflicting signals from people or they get conflicting instructions. And so I think doing them a favor and just simplifying some stuff and being really clear about what is the data that we want from them. We certainly don't want the raw data, but we want the ones from the data from the figures and your analysis. Like that's what we want. We'll help you out. Just do these things, please. I think teamwork and cooperation is where it's at. I mean, don't do research alone. There's a team involved, and it's not just the research team. It's your entire support staff that if your institution's serious has for you. But we don't advertise ourselves very well. Is our problem. One of our problems.
So, thank you. Good summary. Yes, please. Yes, we've got 2 minutes. Just last couple of thoughts from the two of you on, what can we do?
I wanted to circle back to the role of societies, that question, because, I've worked with a lot of different disciplines and they respond differently to different things and they're in different places. And so the societies as the homes of disciplinary communities, that's where the conversations are happening around what we should do with our stuff. And the publishers support that. So I think that's where the support has got to be. And if your society, if your community is not where you wish them to be, talk to an adjacent community and hook on to them and find motivation there, because folks are all in different places. So I suppose I've spent enough time trying to roll the boulder up the mountain to know that if I've got the research community with me, they'll do it for me.
Amen.
One question to the panel.
Sorry. Oh,
Here. Yeah.
Oh.
To be also, is there merit in terms of looking at failed experiments as part of the data collection? Because there's a lot of time saved. That could be a gratification and an incentivization back to the research community. And I understand there's a lot of hesitation in terms of sharing data of the experiments, but what about failed experiments?
Actually, it's interesting. In-house, we have a whole bunch of data scientists, and they're the ones that really want to look at the failed data. And our chemists are okay with it. They're a little confused about why anybody would want that. But I said, well, most of them are puzzled but cooperative, and then there's some that are just don't understand why this is happening. And I think it's really interesting. I just think that publishing them it'd be a huge psychological burden for a lot of these researchers to do that. I think in-house that, if it's all in the building, it's okay. But I think it'd be really hard to get them to publish them, even though I think it would be really interesting to see.
On that note, we are right on time. 1 minute over. Sorry, Deborah. Almost right on time. I would like to thank my fantastic panel and my co-moderator, Erin, for helping to put this panel together. I thought it's been a fascinating conversation. So thank you very much, all of you.